Hey everyone. So I announced I was going to start doing short 5 to 10 minute book reviews for the channel, and this is going to be the first one. And I'm going to be reviewing Don Carpenter's 1966 novel, Hard Rain Falling. And I'd like to begin with a quotation from the first sort of third of the book with no spoilers. And our protagonist, Jack Levitt, finds himself in sort of a county jail, stuck in solitary confinement, in one of the earlier existential moments of what primarily is not really a crime novel at the end. It's an existential novel. But there's no spoilers here, and if there is any spoilers, I'll be sure to announce them prior. This is page 82. He went through self-pity very quickly. It occurred to him, after he had been in endless darkness beyond all question of time, that he would die in there, simply die of the immense loneliness, and that when he died no one would know about it for days, and when they finally did find out, they would unlock the door and remove his body and put it into a wooden coffin and bury it somewhere, without a marker, and that they would put it into the files and that his case was terminated, and that Jack Levitt was no longer an administrative problem. He would be dead and gone, and nobody would mourn his death. They would be relieved because could terminate his file. They would get a sense of satisfaction from having the whole file completed, and maybe they would send to the orphanage and get all the papers on him there, and send to Portland and get the police report on him, and write to the places he worked, and get his work cards, his pay records, every piece of paper on earth with his name on it, and make a big bundle of it all, and take that out of the active file and put it into the inactive file. And then in a few years, when they needed the space in the big green filing cabinet, they would take his folder out of the file and burn it, and he would be gone from the earth, and not one single human being on the face of the earth would know or remember who he had been or care that he was gone. Not one single human being on the face of the earth would mourn his death. So Hard Rain Falling is technically classified as a crime novel, and I will give you an overview of the story just actually from the blurb, because usually overviews and blurbs and descriptions of the plot aren't always that helpful. It's very difficult to write a good one. But Hard Rain Falling follows Jack Levitt, who is an orphan teenager living off his wits in seedy hotels, pool halls, lots of whiskey, lots of basically, trying to find the next time he's going to meet a girl, this kind of thing. He befriends a guy called Billy Lansing, a young black runaway and pool hustler extraordinaire. He gets sent to reform school, which is from the section that I read, which is more like a county jail. Then he eventually goes to San Quentin, and along the way he keeps meeting Billy, but we'll get to this. Now, this novel sort of takes its place in along people maybe such as Richard Fariner in Been Down So Long It Looks Like Up to Me, Richard Bronigan. Maybe it has little sort of a more famous writer that it's sort of akin to would be Bukowski, but it's far more complex and nuanced than Bukowski is in terms of that sort of realist overview of seedy pool hall 60s 70s America. Now, this is really a book that at the beginning is giving, once again, a clear overview and a sort of almost kitchen sink realist descriptions of a class of young men who seem to me to be basically eternal and almost like a Spenglerian cyclic mass of men of young men especially, whose entire meaning of life is found hustling in pool halls, chasing, as the book would say, chasing skirt, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee in cheap diners, and drinking when they can, and basically doing all those things as much as they can, because outside of them, there's no real meaning. And one thing to emphasize about the protagonist, Jack Levitt, is that he's a fighter. He has this immense anger at the world, but he's simultaneously analytical and self-reflective enough to understand that most of the people he's angry at, he has no reason to be. In fact, he almost consistently finds an impotence in his rage, because every time he analyzes the person or the institution whose head he wants to smash in, or the person he wants to fight, he finds that really it's not their fault that he's in this place. And this is ultimately why the novel is existential, is because at the end of these analysis of, you know, the lives of these people, they really have no one to blame, and then they almost can't blame themselves either. They're just this certain class of young men where nothing's ever really happening. And in a certain sense, the novel is reminiscent, or I'm not sure on the time frame actually, but it's like the novel Stoner by John Williams, where people describe it as nothing really happens, but it's a masterpiece, and this novel certainly is a masterpiece. Now, to say nothing happens in this novel would certainly be incorrect. There is a very clear narrative, and there's a very clear story with a certain progression in the character, and that progression does end in a sort of a nihilistic fashion, which I won't spoil. But there's a certain amount of building, but there isn't tension, and it's quite astounding that Carpenter's style, I would state, his style is sort of, you know, it's a beat style, and it's within the scope of 60s and 70s American literature. But at the same time, he manages to retain the reader's interest in his style without ever actually amounting any amount of big intensity in what's going on within the style. So there's sort of one moment in the book that I can think of, thinking back, where there's like, oh, something's building, which is when Jack and the crew have this huge house party, and it's sort of chaotic, but at the same time, because of their ability to be, once again, self-reflective, the whole thing is constantly questioned to the point where it's completely meaningless. And ultimately, you know, this sort of move just from pool halls to drinking, back to smoking, back to, you know, women who are basically in a certain way just these side characters for this crew of young men's aimless lives. It's almost already understood that how can this actually go anywhere, because, you know, all the time they're just searching for money, and when they do get money, they either want more or they just want to gamble all that money away. And there's never actually all that much struggle in getting the money, in finding the pool hall, in finding, you know, tobacco. And there's even at certain points characters admitting that they don't really know why they need the money or why they want the money, but that's the thing to aim for. And it's, you know, a certain amount of as I say, certain young men who have just entirely lost. And Jack Levitt, the protagonist, of course, is an exemplary example of, you know, someone who's grown up in an orphanage, extremely angry, extremely abandoned. But to place it just in that simple sort of coming of age novel with not that much nuance would be incorrect, because Jack Levitt does grow as a character. The brilliance of Carpenter's novel, however, is that the places that he finds himself in, which perhaps he never believed he would be able to. I mean, this is a character who goes from pool halls and seedy motels and this sort of whiskey day drunk, actually ends up studying the works of James Joyce and William Faulkner within the novel. But there's a definite sense that even then he doesn't necessarily belong there, and he doesn't really know where to go from there, and he can't actually control that lifestyle because he's so almost like written into this Bukowski-esque lifestyle. And there's a strange unspoken emphasis, and I don't think this is my own bias bringing this in. There's an unspoken emphasis in certain points throughout the novel, which is why I think it really should be characterized more emphatically as an existential novel, of the godlessness. And I mean, like, theology and God isn't really a key theme in it, but when it's mentioned, there's like an understanding from the characters that if the world is godless, then what else is there to do? And actually, in the introduction to the book, the introduction ends with Carpenter, and this is George Pelecanos, I believe that's pronounced, introduction, and it's the introduction ends with a quote from Don Carpenter, the author, saying, "I'm an atheist. I don't see any moral superstructure to the universe at all. I consider my work optimistic in that the people during the period I'm writing about them are experiencing intense emotion. It is my belief that this is all there is to it. There is nothing beyond this." And so this is really what the characters are finding as well, that there's nothing outside of the lot they've been given in life. And in terms of there not being a moral superstructure, the equality of men is based on the equality of the fact that everyone is just surviving as best they can, and it's dog eat dog, but no one is to blame for that dog eat dog sense of morality and existence. And one thing that really stands out in terms of the book is the pacing. It's sort of relentless, because in what is a 300-page book, we don't actually have the entire life of Jack Levitt. He's lived his life by the time he's 26, been in and out of prison, met these women, had all this extreme freedom that he talks about, and then he leaves prison and he meets another woman, and this isn't necessarily a spoiler, but it's a big part, so I'll pause. He then has a child, and this is really where we find the sort of non-conclusion of the book. And the pacing of the book is brutal in that sense that so much happens within almost 250 pages of the book within the space of 26 years of Levitt's life. And yet you look back on it and you understand all his struggles, you understand his exhaustion, you understand the countless nights and days of feeling ill, being hungover, getting in these fights, getting in these arguments, the jail time, the minor jail time, the loss of friends. And yet in this 26 years, you look back and he's done nothing really, and nothing's really happened. And he goes on to meet some friends that he had when he was younger, and some of them have died, and one of them is explaining to them the ones that have died, and some are basically still in the pool halls doing the same thing. And the whole thing, at a certain sense, has this element of randomness, and in a way it's punctuated with these extremely detailed, almost peculiarly detailed, you wonder why they're so detailed, descriptions of the pool halls and of the hustling of the pool and all the different games, 9-ball, snooker, etc., etc. But these are detailed to the point where you wonder if this is some element where it's the only control, the only place where cause and effect can actually be seen for what it is, and outside of these microcosms of the pool halls where these young men have actual control over what's happening on the board, on the table. Outside of that, they're just completely abandoned to the universe. And one other spoiler here coming up. One thing to mention about this book, in terms of it being extremely ahead of its time as a 1966 novel, is the description eventually when Jack Levitt goes to the sort of main prison sequence in San Quentin. He ends up in a cell with Billy Lansing, who is the pool prodigy he knew from earlier in the book, and they end up having this they end up having an unspoken love. They end up falling in love with each other in the cell, and it's unspoken, and they have no real way to articulate it because of their upbringing, because of the culture. And ultimately in 1966, what we're seeing here, which is why maybe this book was pushed away, a bit forgotten, is you're seeing an interracial homosexual couple amidst that extremely masculine culture of pool halls and smoking and drinking and whiskey. And ultimately this love sort of dissipates like everything else in the book, and you're not entirely sure as the reader what exactly to do with it, because there is another thing that happens there which I won't spoil. And it really goes back to in an odd way, it goes back to the anger of the protagonist, who he states he wants to murder the world. At certain points he says that he just wants to sort of kill someone, because that seems to be almost like the conclusion to everything he's feeling, and he doesn't know what to do with it. And eventually he has the peculiar conclusion or end of the book, in a way. The peculiar fact of it is that in any other book, you would be happy because there seems to be a resolution. This young man seems to be maturing. He seems to have reflected enough that he can understand his faults and what's perhaps wrong with him. right, or where the error of his ways has been. But you, all the while, you're reading the end or the conclusion to his life as a young man, and he doesn't die. That's not a spoiler. You have a feeling he just doesn't belong there, and that this isn't really going to work out. And once again, he's like always already going to be abandoned, and the world already had a place for him, and he shouldn't be where he found himself to be and fell into at the end. And basically, the book at points and all throughout borders on this: are we going to go insane and get into a fight again, or are we just going to accept this sort of utter monotony and repetition? And one thing I think is extremely bold about the book is, despite being punctuated with these unique moments of love, loss, chaos, is that the whole thing is basically held within a cycle, and it basically begins and ends where you knew all along it was going to, but you sort of, perhaps like the protagonist, withheld your judgment that was going to happen altogether, but it does in the end. And in a way, maybe you're left with a tiny bit of optimism, but or a tiny bit of something that there's still at least some possibility for Jack, because so much has happened within such a short space of time, and he's still very young. But whether or not that's the case, we don't know. But I would highly recommend this, and it truly is an unsung masterpiece. So that's Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter, and I should say it's one of the greatest book covers I think I've ever seen. Thanks very much.